Garlic is a strange crop, as it is one of the few vegetables that are primarily grown each year by planting part of last year's crop, rather than growing from true seeds, like with most of the rest of the plants that I grow in my vegetable gardens. Potato plants are also grown by replanting one of the potatoes harvested from the previous season, but I usually buy in fresh seed potatoes each year for a few reasons. So it is only with garlic that I use the process of vegetative propagation to grow the crop each year, simply by separating out the individual cloves from the bulbs of garlic that I harvested from the previous year. And I have been repeating this process of continuing to replant the same lineage of garlic for almost 10 years on this site, always saving the best bulbs for planting next year's crop. And in the process, the bulbs of garlic that I harvest have gradually gotten bigger, which is often seen as the garlic adapting to the local climate. But an experiment that I did this year indicates that something else might be going on, or at least it opens up the possibility of a more nuanced understanding of how garlic crops might change from year to year. The bulbs of garlic that I've grown in the past few years are definitely bigger than the bulbs I originally purchased all those years ago. But this is especially the case with the garlic I've continued to grow in one of my polytunnels. It is unusual to grow garlic in this valuable microclimate, which is usually reserved for the heat-loving crops, as garlic can be so successful in the outside gardens in this climate. But I have found that it is definitely worth it, as I've been able to grow huge garlic bulbs that weigh an average of 135 grams each once dried, and are up to 9 centimeters or 3.5 inches across. This is significantly larger than the bulbs that I originally started growing in this polytunnel, and a lot larger than anything I'm able to grow outside. But I'm interested in why this gradual increase has happened. No doubt, part of it is the better growing conditions within this protected microclimate, with more warmth and less hassle from the wind. And part of it is because I select the biggest cloves from the biggest bulbs each year for planting the next crop, which gives the young plants a strong start, helping to produce bigger plants by the summer, resulting in bigger bulbs being harvested and even bigger cloves for planting the following year. But I also suspect that there are other factors involved, such as improving soil conditions and soil fertility, and hopefully because I'm becoming a better grower with more experience. I've also seen this gradual increase in bulb size in the plants grown in the outside gardens, though the difference is not as pronounced, and I've always thought that this was because it's not as warm or there aren't as ideal growing conditions outside. There is also this idea that garlic plants gradually adapt to local growing conditions after years of replanting. I've always thought that this was part of the process, though I never really understood the mechanism involved, as the plant one year is essentially just the continuation of the plant from the previous year. And with this vegetative propagation, no matter how many times it is replanted, it is still the same plant, and is essentially a clone. This is very different from the process of cross-pollination of flowers, where the natural variability that exists within the genetics of the selected plants produces variations within the next generations of seed that are produced, where each seed can be subtly different from the next. This can be the mechanism through which you can end up with significantly different strain or variety of vegetables than you had started with, or how new varieties of vegetables can actually be developed. But this natural variability that's inherent within seed propagation is apparently not there with vegetative propagation, where there is supposed to be an identical genetic match between one season and the next. And this is why some people claim that garlic doesn't adapt to local conditions, and instead any changes are due to the increasing size of the garlic cloves that are actually planted, or the improving skills of the grower, or some other factor. I am not sure about all of this, but an exploration that I did with different batches of garlic that I grew this year has led me to think that something interesting is going on. I have been replanting the same lineage of garlic in the polytunnel for 8 seasons. Although there are variations in the weather from year to year, it is essentially the same microclimate for the garlic plants to adapt to, if that is what actually happens. But for the outside gardens, I usually have planted the larger cloves that were grown inside the polytunnel, because I wanted to start the plants off with the bigger cloves, and it saved the effort of saving separate batches of bulbs for regrowing. I knew this was distorting things and preventing me from seeing what would happen if the garlic adapted to the weather outside, or if there would be any divergence from the original strain that was continuing to grow in the polytunnel. For this reason, a few years ago I started to save bulbs from the 4 gardens outside, in addition to the original lineage from the polytunnel, and started the process of planting each garden with the cloves grown in that garden. It has only been a couple of cycles of replanting, and probably not enough for much adaptation to actually occur. But this year I decided to plant half of the garlic patch grown in each of the 4 outside gardens with the best bulbs from that garden last year, and half from the larger bulbs grown in the polytunnel. I mainly wanted to see if there would be a difference in the plants based on the clove size. So I weighed the cloves that I selected for planting in each of the batches, and there was significant difference in the average weight. I selected the largest cloves for replanting in the polytunnel, and the ones selected for the same batch for planting outside were slightly smaller, at an average of 8 grams each. The average weight of the cloves planted from each of the outside gardens ranged from 5.2 grams to 6.8 grams. And all of these cloves were planted into the ground at about the same time and with the same basic care, but with different planting densities and soil conditions in the different gardens. But within each garden, the 2 sets of plants from different cloves were treated the same. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I was hoping that the larger cloves would in fact produce significantly larger plants and bulbs. And the initial growth in the spring did show slightly stronger growth and larger plants at the start, which is to be expected as there would be more energy and nutrients available in the larger cloves to give the young plants a head start. But it was later in the season when the plants were bigger that I noticed significant differences between the pairs of batches in all 4 of the outside gardens. The plants grown from the cloves produced in the polytunnel were consistently larger than the plants grown from the cloves originating in the outside gardens. Some of this could definitely be explained by the larger average clove size, but the difference seemed to be disproportionate. For example, the cloves from the polytunnel were only 17% bigger than the cloves from the polyculture garden, but the plants seemed to be much more than 17% bigger. And while the 17% difference was with the average clove size, there were some cloves grown outside that were bigger than the cloves grown in the polytunnel, but this overlap didn't seem to be reflected in the plants in the garden. I felt that something else was going on here, in addition to the larger clove size at the start, and the plants grown from the polytunnel cloves seemed stronger and healthier as the season progressed into the summer when the plants started to mature. There was also something strange with the timing of the secondary growth that I typically find with this garlic variety. I don't have any experience with other varieties of garlic, but the variety that I've been growing for years seems to produce double or triple cloves, with new leaves growing up through the stem of the plant. I don't know if this is very common or something that has just developed with a particular strain that I've been growing, or a result of plants being able to grow much bigger than usual. It does seem to help to make the bulbs grow a lot bigger, increasing the yield, so I've never really worried about it. The plants grown in the polytunnel developed this secondary growth first, and then a few weeks later, the secondary growth started on the outside plants that were grown from the outside cloves. But at first, these additional leaves did not appear on the adjacent plants grown from the cloves produced in the polytunnel. It took another few weeks before this secondary growth started to form on these plants, and this delay in development was the same across all 4 outside gardens. I harvested most of the garlic in the polytunnel first, as usual, though a bit earlier this year than in previous years, to catch the bulbs before they grew too big and split their skins. A few weeks later, I began digging up the plants in the outside gardens, and I was quite surprised at the difference in the development between the pairs. The plants grown from the outside cloves seemed a bit overdeveloped, as if they'd been in the ground too long, and the skins on some of them were already starting to split. But the plants that were grown from the polytunnel cloves were quite large, but definitely seemed immature, and would have benefited from growing for another few weeks. These bulbs did not yet have the characteristic bulging of the cloves, and the bulbs were smaller in proportion to the size of the neck or stem and the leaves, at least compared to what I expect from this variety when it is mature. It was as if they were from a different variety of garlic that matured later, or that they'd been planted later, but they'd all been planted at the same time. And the difference was the same across all the pairs of garlic batches in the 4 outside gardens. So the garlic plants grown in the polytunnel developed a secondary growth and matured first, and the batches of garlic grown in the outside gardens from cloves produced in those gardens were a few weeks later. But the plants grown outside from cloves produced in the polytunnel last year took an additional 2 weeks to reach the same stages of development, and it seems that they needed a couple of more weeks for the bulbs to properly mature. I think this delay allowed the tops of the plants to grow larger before the plants started to put all of the energy into developing the bulb underground, which would have been significantly larger if I hadn't harvested them too early. But the only difference, beyond a moderately larger average clove size at planting, was the lineage of the cloves were separated a few years ago. And I expect that a couple of years is not enough time for this kind of adaptation to take place in the genetics or characteristics of the different strains of garlic. And if garlic does adapt to the local climate, I would have thought that the plants grown from cloves that were grown in the same climate would do better, but the opposite seems to have been the case. The only thing that makes sense to me is somehow the clove that was planted outside remembered the warmer conditions that it was grown in within the polytunnel. And the plants delayed the date that they stopped growth of the leaves and started focusing energy on developing the bulb under the soil, as if it was expecting more cumulative growth before it reached that point. I really have no idea how this would happen, or if there is something else entirely that's going on that I'm not aware of. In the past, it made a certain amount of sense to use the bigger cloves from the polytunnel for planting all of the garlic in all of the gardens. And after this year's exploration, I was much happier with results from these polytunnel cloves, even if the crop matured a few weeks later. Perhaps it's unfair to compare the two, as the garlic that was grown outside had not had many years to adapt to this outside climate, so I'm not really comparing like with like. But on the basis of this one limited trial, it seems I get better garlic outside from cloves grown in the protected climate of the polytunnel. And perhaps I don't need to know why or how this is the case, just that it works for me, at least with the variety or strain of garlic that I'm currently growing. But it does seem to go against the general idea that plants that are adapted to the local conditions will do better. Whatever the reasons, I decided to leave about 1/3 of the polytunnel garlic crop in the ground for a few extra weeks before harvesting, so that the cloves could grow even bigger for planting all of the gardens next year. But perhaps I should also save the best bulbs from each of the other gardens and to replant them again next year in the same side-by-side trial to see if the observations that I made this year are repeated.